everyone, and thank you for joining today's annual meeting session. My name is Ali Land, and I'm the Deputy Project Manager working with BJ's Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. As a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And now I will pass it off to Dr. Michael White from Arizona State University to begin the session, what research is telling us about body-worn camera practice. Mike?
All right, thanks, Ali. Thanks everyone for joining our panel. Well, I'll just offer a couple of remarks to get us rolling, and then I'll turn it over to our first presenter. This panel is about research. As I was listening to the opening comments from Martin at PERF, it strikes me that the conference that he was describing was in 2013. That's barely 10 years ago. If you think about how quickly body-worn cameras have been adopted and diffused in American policing, it's really startling. The latest statistics I've seen is, by 2020, which was 3 years ago, nearly 2/3 of law enforcement agencies had deployed cameras, and so there's been just this rapid diffusion of cameras, and thankfully for us, the research has developed almost as quickly. So back when PERF held that conference in 2013, there were about 5 studies that had been conducted at that point. 5. And a couple of them weren't very good, to be quite honest. As we sit here in late 2023, I don't even know how many body-worn camera studies have been conducted. Well over 100, maybe 125. So that's the good news. Is we researchers, I'll put myself in that category, have really gotten our butts moving in terms of catching up and providing some evidence that can inform departments that are deploying cameras. In fact, I would argue that the research that's been done over the last several years has been one of the drivers of adoption, especially if you think about those early studies that were done that focused on force and complaints and produced some really compelling findings in terms of how an agency could limit those important outcomes with the deployment of cameras. And as the research base has grown over the last decade, the outcomes that folks are examining are much more diverse than just force, just complaints. We see studies that look at the impact on downstream court outcomes, that look at the impact on activation or procedural justice. There are even a couple of actual by economists cost-benefit analyses that have been done. So the evidence has grown rapidly. It's really strong in some areas. I think it's mixed in some other areas, and then just emerging in a few areas. So what we want to do is we want to hear from 3 researchers who are at the forefront in terms of the work that they're doing. They're pushing the bounds. We've got, and I think I see the order of presentations on that slide there. We're going to start with Dr. Jesse Huff at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And then we'll go to Dr. Nusrat Sahin at Stockton. He's doing some very important work with some agencies in New Jersey. And then Dr. Dan Lawrence at CNA. And in terms of the organization, I think each of our presenters is going to have some slides for us to look at that's going to detail the work that they're doing. And we'll try to keep them at 10 minutes. That'll be my biggest challenge, is keeping a bunch of PhDs to adhere to time limitations. And then I have a couple of questions I can ask of our presenters, but we also want to be mindful of the comments that are coming in the chat. And so we've got 50 minutes. Let me stop talking. I'll turn it over to Jesse and we can get rolling. So Jesse, it's all yours. And I would ask, as you finish your presentation, please just turn it over to the next presenter. Jesse.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. So my name is Jesse Huff. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And today I want to talk to you about some research that I've been working on with Mike White, Eileen Maum, and Chuck Katz that's looking at the prevalence and predictors of police body-worn camera activation. Next slide, please. So we all know the impetus for adopting body-worn cameras. We've seen really widespread calls for police reform, and body-worn cameras are often promoted to increase the transparency and accountability of police behavior, as well as citizen behavior, by providing video evidence of what's going on in specific encounters. And as Mike just mentioned, we've seen a lot of early evidence of body-worn camera effectiveness, especially in the areas of police use of force and civilian complaints. However, there have been challenges realizing the promise of body-worn cameras, and one of the major ones is just officer failure to activate. So if an officer is wearing a camera and doesn't turn it on, we're not able to gather that evidence that we really wanted to get by that video footage. This will also undermine a potential civilizing effect through not recording that behavior. There's no real motivation to improve that behavior. as well as public concerns. When we have these contentious incidents between police and civilians, and an officer is wearing a camera and they didn't actually turn it on, that can be really challenging for people to accept. Ultimately, this represents an implementation failure. It's the same thing as prescribing someone the proverbial pill, but them choosing simply not to take it. So there has been prior research examining body-worn camera activation. However, this has largely focused at the incident level, looking at what types of encounters are officers more likely to activate their body-worn cameras during. And research generally finds that officers are more likely to activate during violent incidents, incidents that involve victims. Some studies find that incidents involving male officers are more likely to result in a camera being turned on than those involving female officers. And some research conducted in Anaheim, California, found kind of a wide range in officer level activation rates. So officers in that study were activating anywhere from 0 to 72% of the time when they were responding to calls for service. So this prior research really suggests that these incident level factors matter for understanding when an officer is going to turn their camera on. But we really don't know if officer characteristics can influence activation rates. And so that really brings us to the current study. We were really interested in this question: is it possible to identify those officers who might be low body-worn camera activators or who might decrease their use of body-worn cameras over time? So we wanted to answer 3 research questions in this study. We just wanted to understand, is there notable variation in officer level activation rates across demographic characteristics, features of officers' job assignments, things like their precinct, their shift, or other indicators of performance? So those officers who might receive more civilian complaints or might be using force, are they activating their cameras in different ways? So for this study, we used administrative data collected from the Phoenix Police Department from an 18-month evaluation of body-worn cameras. A large amount of data was collected as part of that study. And for the purposes of this one, we aggregated all of these incident level factors to the officer level to look at how we could assess trends in officer activation. Our outcomes of interest were simply the number of times an officer activated their body-worn camera. So how often are they activating? And on average, this was about 63% of all calls for service. But we were also interested in their trends in activation over time. So whether officers were decreasing their use of body-worn cameras over time, whether they weren't really changing how often they use their cameras, or of course, whether they were increasing their use of cameras. So turning to the results. So first, just descriptively, we wanted to kind of look at officer patterns in activation over the study period. So the thin gray lines here represent individual officers, and this is just the percentage of calls for service in which they activated their body-worn cameras. The thick black line there in the middle is the mean activation across the study period. So what we can see is that activation started fairly low. It was down below 40%. However, it did jump up to the high 70% area and then kind of leveled out throughout the rest of the study period. But what we can see from these gray lines is there really is a lot of variation in individual officer activation, and we can see them kind of jumping up and down over time. So in order to predict activation counts, we estimated a series of negative binomial regression models using number of calls for service as an exposure variable. So this is getting us to that officer rates of activation. We estimated a few separate models. So first we looked solely at officer demographic characteristics, then we looked just at job-related factors, then officer performance, and finally a full model, which included all of our variables of interest. And what we found was that, in terms of demographics, men have higher activation counts relative to women, but we did not find any significant relationship between officer job-related characteristics or other measures of officer performance and how often they were activating their cameras. In the full model, where we looked at all of these variables together, the only statistically significant finding suggests that officers assigned to the Central City precinct have a lower activation rate relative to officers in Mountain View. We were also interested in looking at officer activation over time. So what we found was about 13% of officers, when they first started wearing a body-worn camera, were low activators. So they were activating their cameras less than 1 standard deviation away from the mean relative to their peers at that same time period. 4% of officers started low and ended low, so they never increased their activation over the course of the study. However, 6% went from that low category and moved up into the average category, so they were activating similarly to their peers. And about 3% actually ended in the high category, so they went from being well below their peers to being more than 1 standard deviation above the mean relative to their peers. Click the next button, you'll see that about 70% of officers were average when they started. So they were activating right in line with their peers. 17% ended up moving to that low category by the end of wearing a body-worn camera. 43% stayed average throughout the entire time, and 11% ended in the high category. So they moved from average to activating more often. And then finally, we had about 15% of officers who started as high activators. So from immediately wearing a body-worn camera, they were activating more than their peers. And if you click the next button, you'll see that 4% of these officers did dip down to that low category at the end of the study period. 9% dipped down into average, so they were activating in line with their peers, but 3% did remain in that high category. And if we look at this in a multivariate model, we estimated a series of multinomial logistic regression models, which allowed us to compare officers who either didn't change their activation or officers who increased activation to those officers who declined over time. In terms of officer demographic characteristics, there were no significant relationships, but there was a relatively large gender effect here. Men were much more likely to increase their activation patterns than they were to decrease it. In terms of officer job-related characteristics, those officers assigned to the South Mountain Precinct and to swing shift were less likely to increase than to decrease. So they were using their cameras less over time as they experienced wearing them. And then in terms of performance, officers who conducted more arrests were more likely to increase body-worn camera use over the study period. In the full model, many of these results became statistically insignificant, with the exception of South Mountain. Officers assigned to that precinct remained less likely to increase than to decrease their activation over time. So to put this all together in terms of what it means, we'll see that these officer level factors have a really limited influence on activation and activation trends. It doesn't necessarily matter who the officer is, where they work, or what other behaviors they engage in. And so this really kind of confirms prior research, which suggests that activation is really an incident level decision. Officers, when they're choosing to activate their camera, are really responding to the factors that exist in that specific situation. This is consistent with prior research, suggesting that activation depends on what's happening in the moment and not necessarily the characteristics of the specific officer involved. So in terms of recommendations for policy, for the Phoenix Police Department, instead of focusing on specific types of officers to increase activation, it would be more helpful to focus on those incidents that result in low compliance. In this case, these are generally really minor types of encounters. So things like traffic stops, disorder type offenses. By focusing on activation compliance in these low encounters, we can make sure that they are gathering all of that footage that we need, that evidence that we need, in compliance with policy to make sure that the benefits of body-worn cameras are realized, that we're actually using them the way that they're intended to be used in the field. So thank you for your attention. I hope I made it to that 10 minutes, which is always tough for an academic, but I will turn it over to the next presenter.
This is Nusrat Sahin from Stockton University, New Jersey. I will be talking about the impact of body-worn cameras on police accountability and adjudication of citizen complaints. All right, so I want to go over why police use body-worn cameras. From the literature, we know that they might be using cameras to document evidence, train officers, improve citizen and officer behavior, strengthening accountability and transparency, reducing and resolving complaints, providing an independent view on events, protecting officers from frivolous complaints. So in today's presentation, I will be focusing on accountability and transparency aspect of body-worn cameras, as well as their impact on reducing and resolving complaints. So the first research is on adjudication of citizen complaints. With my colleagues, Dr. Çubukçu, Dr. Tekin, and Dr. Topallik, we published in Justice Quarterly an article on the effect of body-worn cameras on adjudication of citizen complaints of police misconduct. All right, as you can see, I shared the data and some of the findings here. As the data, we use citizen complaints data from the Chicago Police Department and the Civilian Office of Police Accountability filed between the years of 2013 and 2020. So Chicago Police Department deployed cameras step by step, and the staggered deployment of cameras in 22 districts in 2016 and 2017 gave us an opportunity to compare what happens before and after the deployment of cameras. So we used that data set, and our findings supported that after the deployment of cameras, the cameras generate evidence of police misconduct. And we have fewer dismissals of complaints against officers, more disciplinary action, and reduction in disparity in complaint outcomes across racial groups. And actually, body-worn cameras remedy racial disparities in complaint resolution outcomes. So I would like to turn to the tables that I shared with you. In panel A, as you can see, after the deployment of cameras, we see the likelihood of not sustained finding decreases, whereas the likelihood of sustained finding increases. And for sustained finding, this is actually statistically significant. When we look at the interaction effect of race on the impact of body-worn cameras on citizen complaints, we see that Black citizens' complaints were at a higher level. They tend to be not sustained before the cameras, but after the deployment of the cameras, not sustained rate for Black complainants almost came the same level as whites and Hispanics, which tells us the clear message that the body-worn cameras may have an impact on, minimizing racial disparities in our criminal justice system. In the second research, I will be talking about strengthening accountability and transparency by using body-worn cameras. We were awarded a National of Justice grant back in 2021 to test a new protocol which combines the best practices of procedural justice with body-worn cameras. And we call this model as AppJets, and we are still in the data collection phase. So I want to give you a brief description about what we have in this design. So Atlantic City and Pleasantville Police Departments, these are both in Atlantic County in New Jersey, they're stopping speeders for us. And we randomly assign these speeders to the control group and experimental group. The people in the control group receive business as usual treatment with body-worn camera activation because, the state of New Jersey requires all police officers to activate their cameras during a traffic stop. In the experimental condition, we provide officers a script and they go over the script. They mention some of the elements of procedural justice as well as crash statistics. And also they activate their body-worn cameras, but beyond that, they give access to the footage to citizens within 4 to 7 days. I wanted to show you our workflow diagram on how this works. So when someone is being stopped, as I said, because of speeding, that person will be given an access code. The citizen keeps that access code. On the right-hand side, you can see the pamphlets that we printed out and the codes. I just blocked all those codes because those are unique codes for each citizen. We don't want anyone other than that person to see the footage. So we give them a unique code, 10-digit unique code, and citizen just leaves with that code. And after the stop, we contact PDs and we ask them to share the footage with us over evidence.com. And we have a redaction team. We redact these videos by using Axon's reduction tool as well as Final Cut Pro. And we redact the videos and make it available to a police supervisor over our website. We have a website where we can share, and all the police supervisors have access to it. They have their login credentials. So they review the video. If they say that it is okay to release the video, we make it available to the citizen. If they say that further reductions are needed, we redact the video more, we trim it. And if they say that there's an investigation and we can't really release this, then we let the citizen know that the video can't be released and they can call our office to get more information about why video would not be able to release. I just wanted to quickly share preliminary findings with you because we're still collecting data. We completed 60% of data collection. We approach drivers after traffic stops and offer them a survey. And since the start of the project, 350 drivers responded to our survey, and I included some statistics here, and I conducted a t-test. In here, the lowest score, 1, indicates the higher level of agreement with the given statement. So as you can see, there's just a significant difference between the experimental and control group in terms of their perceptions of police professionalism attributed to the body-worn camera usage. So as you can see, we included 2 questions in our survey. The first question is, I believe police officers with body-worn camera act more professionally. And the second question is, I think police officers that I interacted with today acted more professionally because she was wearing a body-worn camera. So as we can see from here, there's a significant difference between the perceptions in on the people who assigned to the experimental condition and the control condition. I think we will discuss more. We will have a Q&A section, and I would like to turn to Dr. White.
Thank you, Professor Sahin. Okay, Dan Lawrence, bring us home.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Lawrence. I'm a senior research scientist at the CNA Corporation Center for Justice Research and Innovation. I'm really excited to be here to talk today about studies that I've been involved in that have examined the impact of body-worn cameras. So I'm going to be talking to you about 3 different body-worn camera studies that I have been involved in. The first was with the Anaheim Police Department, funded by Arnold Ventures. This was an earlier study in the world of body-worn camera research. It was a randomized control trial with 60 officers as the department was first doing a pilot deployment of the cameras. The second study was with the Milwaukee Police Department, where we conducted a large randomized control trial with 504 officers over a 9-month period. And during that time, the rest of the department was also deployed cameras. And we were able to conduct a quasi-experimental analysis with all 1,100 officers that got cameras. Most recently, we conducted the first randomized control trial of body-worn cameras in a correctional facility with the Loudoun County Adult Detention Center. And this was a study that involved 12 units in that facility, and it was over a 1-year period. So I'll talk about the main findings and the big impacts from each of these studies, and I'm going to apologize up front for the knowledge dump that I'm about to do, but there's a lot of really interesting and different types of findings that I want to talk about here. So first with the Anaheim study, which I mentioned occurred earlier in the world of body-worn camera research. One thing that we wanted to examine was whether or not community members actually were able to acknowledge that body-worn cameras were present during their interactions. So we ended up surveying 384 community members, and only about 30% of them, 29% of them, were actually able to accurately remember whether or not a body-worn camera was present during their police interaction. The majority couldn't remember at all, and only about 28% incorrectly remembered. So there was a camera and they thought there wasn't, or vice versa. And there's a lot of reasons that this might be. For one, body-worn cameras were relatively new at the time. So major deployments of body-worn cameras really started in 2012. This was around 2015. And like Dr. White mentioned earlier, now we're up much, much higher. But second, the reason that community members might miss the presence of a body-worn camera is that there really is a lot of equipment on officers. And community members aren't really paying attention to all those different pieces of equipment. They're focusing on the officer themselves. So it's perhaps not surprising that people really aren't noticing the cameras or remembering they're present when they're involved in an interaction. Another main finding from the Anaheim study was that the presence of a body-worn camera related to more positive views of satisfaction with the encounter and perceiving the outcome as fair, but aspects of procedural justice behaviors were found to be even more important. So for example, the bars on that leftmost side, they show the standardized beta values of how satisfied community members were with the interaction with a police officer. And you can see that body-worn cameras had a value of 0.11, so a significant positive relation to satisfaction with the encounter, but showing, having the officer show empathy and being a neutral decision maker were 2 to 5 times stronger than having a body-worn camera alone. And this really shows that body-worn cameras are not a panacea for community policing, police-community relationships. Police officers really do need to act respectfully, professionally, let the community member have a voice in the interaction. All the tenets of procedural justice that have, very historically well documented to historically show that they improve community perspectives of the interactions. And the last main finding that Dr. Huff already alluded to a little bit from the study that we did was looking at how activation rates of cameras vary by officers over time and by policing events. So in that left chart there, each of those black dots represent an individual officer in the study with their rates of activation during a 6-month period. And you can see that the activation rates vary quite widely across the officers, with one officer with 0 activation during those 6 months, and another up to 72% activation. And the chart on the right there shows activations over time during that 6-month period. You can see that it started off relatively low, and toward the end of the study, it raised upwards to about 55% activation as officers were conducting their policing activities. A lot of this likely comes from officers becoming more comfortable with the cameras over time and developing the muscle memory to activate their cameras when they start a community interaction. And I don't have a table here showing the activations in terms of policing event, but what we found was that police officers are much more likely to activate their cameras when there was the likelihood that evidence could be collected. So for instances of violent crime and property crime, the activation rates were much higher compared to instances of assisting the public or minor crimes or proactive policing. And like Dr. Huff just mentioned, this is really a missed opportunity for law enforcement agencies to collect positive interactions with community members. And these are types of interactions that they can showcase more publicly to help support building trust and understanding of police work, as well as collecting additional data about the interactions that are occurring. So switching to the Milwaukee study, I'll first outline some of the main impacts from this study. And as a reminder, this was it had both a 9-month-long randomized control trial with 504 officers, as well as a quasi-experimental analysis that examined the impact over time with 1,100 officers who received cameras. So one of our papers looked at a different approach than others and examined how cameras affect proactive activities of officers. So the activities that they do when they're not responding to a call for service. We found that the amount of overall proactive activities did not change, but the makeup within those activities did. Specifically, the amount of traffic stops and business checks did not change, but officers equipped with body-worn cameras conducted 8% fewer subject stops and 23% more parks and walks. And I see this as a real benefit of body-worn cameras. This is a real positive impact. They're reducing those community interactions that have a much higher potential to end badly, plus potentially in a use of force, while they're also increasing activities that are much more seen as a positive type of behavior from community members. And in regard to the more traditional metrics, namely complaints and use of force, we found that there was a 51% reduction in complaints among officers equipped with a body-worn camera in the randomized control trial, although it's worth noting that this was only marginally significant. In the quasi-experimental analysis with the full 1,100 officers, we found that body-worn cameras essentially resulted in a 6% reduction in complaints each month that resulted in an overall reduction by 29%. For use of force, there was no impact overall. We found that there was an interesting aspect to this, though. At first, the cameras reduced use of force by 15% in the first month that officers were equipped with them. But over time, rates for use of force increased by roughly 2% each month following that first 15% reduction. And this eventually reached back to normal levels matching pre-implementation. So this might be getting at the fact that uses of force in policing are extremely rare events to begin with, and there's always going to be a base amount of force that's necessary to do the police work. Body-worn cameras increase the scrutiny towards officers, and they certainly feel that. So force levels drop down initially in that first month, but they return to normal levels over time because it's simply part of the job. In Milwaukee, we also conducted 3 waves of citywide community surveys. I'll quickly note the findings here. First, and not surprising, we found that knowledge of the Milwaukee police officers having body-worn cameras increased over time from 36% of the community knowing that across the city at the start of the program to 76% about a year and a half after the full deployment with the program. And one thing I would emphasize here is that regression analyses show that knowing about a body-worn camera program was positively related to views of the department's legitimacy. However, that knowledge of the body-worn camera program did not relate to supporting the program itself, whereas positive views of the department's legitimacy did relate to support for the cameras. So the takeaway here is that educating the community about a body-worn camera program alone is really not sufficient to improving police-community relations. It's in fact more important to focus on ways to build community trust and views of legitimacy outside of body-worn camera programs. So this is sort of similar to the findings that we found in Anaheim as well. So now switching to the Loudoun County Jail study. Again, this was the first randomized control trial of body-worn cameras in a correctional setting. So we're very excited about this study, and we have multiple articles coming out from this. We just had one released this past week. Our main findings focused on the impact of body-worn cameras that they had on responses to resistance and resident injuries. We found that the amount of responses to resistance were 40% lower in months where the unit was assigned cameras, and this included 52% fewer responses involving active resistance and 37% fewer responses involving physical controls. There were very few resident injuries in general during these response to resistance, only 18 responses to resistance over the year, and 18 injuries total. There were 97 responses to resistance, 18 of those had injuries. 5 of them occurred when the cameras were present, and the other 13 were when the cameras weren't present. And this corresponds to the amount of injuries during response events being 58% lower in unit months with the body-worn cameras. So these are really positive findings for body-worn cameras in correctional settings. There are a lot of reasons why body-worn cameras may have a greater impact in corrections than in policing. So for example, much of policing is already very public, interactions occurring in the public setting with community members who record the interactions with their cell phones, whereas aspects of corrections are almost entirely hidden from the public view. So as a result, correction officers may feel much more pressure than police officers to better their behaviors with residents as a result of having a recording of their interactions. That said, we also conducted surveys with the deputies in the facility and found that the only aspects where significant changes were noted were found over time there was a negative impact on the views of resident-deputy relationships. The deputies did perceive the cameras to affect their work activities, improve resident behaviors, or reduce disruptions. So in interviews with the deputies, what we found is that they really expressed concern that the residents would no longer candidly speak with them because they were aware that the conversations were now being audio recorded, and the deputies felt that this severely affected their relationship and their ability to build rapport with the residents. So this is just for your information. If you're able to download these slides, this is a list of the full publications from this. We can just skip to the next slide. The articles, I'm really happy to share those. This is my contact information. And I'd also be remiss not to mention that these projects were certainly team efforts. So I'd like to thank Nancy Levine on her work with the Anaheim project, Bryce Peterson on his work with the Milwaukee and Loudoun project, and Mike White, Chip Coldren, and Brittany Cunningham for including me on the Loudoun work. So thanks so much.
Thanks to the three of you. So I thought what I'd do is just kind of hone in on one or two thoughts for each presentation, and then we can get to questions. I'm going to start with a question that came into the chat for Dr. Huff. But before I get there, I just wanted to, as I said, highlight a few points. The three researchers we just heard from really are looking at very important outcomes with regard to body-worn cameras. So we heard in the opening session with Colby and Martin a heavy focus on activation. And I think it was Colby who talked about failure to activate is general implementation failure. And we heard from two of our researchers on this panel discussing that issue, both Dr. Huff and Dr. Lawrence. But as I think about Dr. Huff's presentation, and keep in mind her work is with Phoenix, and Phoenix PD is an early adopter. They've had cameras since 2013, so they may be in a very different space than your organization if you're just starting. But when it comes to thinking about what drives activation and whether an officer is activating or not, I think the big takeaway from Dr. Huff's presentation is a department really needs to begin thinking about low activation incidents, not necessarily searching for low activation officers, because based on the results of her work, it's not really characteristics of the officer that are determining activation or not. It's much more about the encounter. And I think that's a really important distinction. And it'll be interesting to see if that kind of finding is present in other departments. So it's really about the incidents themselves more so than it is about the officers. That said, I'm going to come back to Dr. Huff in a second and ask her about the male versus female finding. But with Professor Sahin and his presentation looking, and we heard from about a couple of different projects, but I'm going to focus in on the first one, which looked at complaints in Chicago. And I think, that particular outcome, that's an area where I think the findings are really robust. There are about 35 studies that have examined the impact of body-worn cameras on the prevalence of citizen complaints. Of those 35 studies, 28 show a reduction. And that is pretty powerful. That's over 80% of studies showing a reduction in complaints. But that body of research really is just focused on, do complaints go up or down after cameras are rolled out? What Professor Sahin is looking at is a much deeper question, which is the impact of the footage, the evidence that is collected. How does that influence not the flow or the amount of complaints that are coming in, but what happens to them when they actually arrive at the Chicago Police Department? How are they processed? And he documented some really important findings that evidence is producing. You have fewer dismissals. Of course, we know and have known for decades that the vast majority of complaints that come in pre body-worn camera really had very little available evidence to show either that the allegation happened or that it didn't. It was the officer's word versus the complainant. And now with body-worn cameras, we've got that footage. And what we're seeing with Professor Sahin's research there is that you're seeing fewer dismissals. And at the same time, you're seeing an increase in discipline against officers. And just as importantly, there were racial disparities in how complaints were processed pre-body-worn camera deployment in Chicago, and those have disappeared. So really, really important outcomes in Chicago in terms of the evidence that's being generated and how it's impacting the handling of complaints. And then with Dr. Lawrence, he talked about 3 different very important studies. I think the findings from Milwaukee illustrate the complex, nuanced impacts that body-worn cameras can have in terms of proactivity versus complaints versus use of force. And I'm part of the Loudon study, so it's very exciting to see. And as Dr. Lawrence said, this is the first really rigorous study in a correctional setting. Some of these findings that we've seen in the policing field for a long time now are translating to a correctional setting in terms of reductions in force and injury. So 3 really important presentations there. And I have some questions myself, but I do want to get to John Markovic's question, and it is for Dr. Huff. And I just talked about how it was all about the incident. Well, it was, except for one finding, which was that at least in Phoenix, it appears that male officers are more likely to activate than female officers. And Dr. Huff, I don't know if you've read the question, but John has some thoughts about why that might be, and he wants to hear what you think about in terms of that particular finding.
Yes, thank you, Dr. White, and thank you, John, for your question. I do think this gender finding is really interesting. As you mentioned in your question, I know there are some concerns that activation could lead officers to respond more formally to incidents. And so, if women are responding to things and want to, go for some kind of informal disposition, that may cause them not to activate their camera so they can attempt to resolve a situation in a different way. I certainly think that's possible. I think it's also possible that women and men in Phoenix are just responding to different types of incidents. So maybe this is an incident level difference in officers that's manifesting in a gender difference when we look at officer level counts. So, we consistently see that activation is more likely to occur in violent incidents, in property incidents, as Dr. Lawrence mentioned. If male officers in Phoenix are more likely to respond to those types of events than female officers, that could be driving that gender finding that we're seeing in those counts between the men and women in that agency. So something that we are going to look at kind of down the road is this interaction effect. Like, what is causing these differences in gender? Is it something about the incidents they're responding to? Is it something about the work groups that they're a part of? Or even the types of dispositions that they're giving when they're using cameras compared to when they're not? Because I do think this is a really important question and something that, hopefully we can tease out a little bit down the road. So thank you so much for raising this. I really appreciate it.
All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. I'll keep an eye on that. I have a couple of questions that I haven't shared with our presenters because I wanted to surprise them to see how they think on their feet. Actually, and I think this first one's pretty easy, and it's about reaching your audience. The 3 researchers we have on this panel are very adept not only at conducting research, but also communicating that research to practitioners in the field who can then use that to make decisions and inform the decisions that they make with regard to body-worn cameras. So let's go in the order of how you presented, but just can you give the audience one good example of, and you can be very specific, one good example of how you translated your findings from your rigorous research studies to an agency in the field or a representative in an effort to make sure that the evidence made it to the right audience. So Dr. Huff, why don't we start with you?
Sure. This was something that the Phoenix Police Department was really interested in when we first started conducting the surveys about body-worn cameras. Because they were early adopters, a lot of officers were really resistant to this. So one of the things that we did was we continually fed, both our technical reports, of course, back to the agency so they had access to that. But Phoenix also has these little bulletins that they would send out. And as part of those bulletins, they would push out, these are the findings of that survey you took. So the officers could actually see, oh, hey, I remember answering this questionnaire and this is what ended up happening with that. And I think that was satisfying for them because they got to see kind of the back end product and not just that, we sat through the briefing with the girl with the clipboard, and now, we have this camera thing. Like, they got to see how that actually played out in their agency. I think the other thing that's really huge here is conveying your findings in a way that's like digestible. So we talk about, kind of these complex statistical models, but if you can boil it down to a single figure, that can be really powerful. So that activation graph that I showed today is really similar to a different graph that I did for Phoenix that looked at how activation changed after they changed their policy. And just being able to show that picture spoke 1,000 words. So anytime you can take something and put it into a format that's just easy to look at and understand will change the story completely.
Great, thank you. Dr. Sahin, can you give us an example of how you've translated your research findings to practitioners in the field?
I just try to have close contact with the practitioners in the field. I'm attending ride-alongs with them, and I observe whether they activate their cameras or like after they activate their cameras. Another issue that I observed is they tend to not tag their videos because this is just going, if you're using Exxon, this is just going to the evidence.com, and your supervisors need to see them, watch them if needed. And so, well, we shared these findings with, again, the police leadership and to get their buy-in. And, like these type of initiatives are usually coming from top down, like the Attorney General is mandating that, okay, you gotta, like start your camera or when there's an interaction, but officers think that they are being observed. They have some privacy concerns, and actually, when we talk to them one-on-one, we just explain that this evidence shows that actually you may be exonerated because there's an evidence. So this is not just like and again that the research that you referred to shows clearly that there used to be gray areas. Like it was like what officer said, what the person said, but after the release of the body-worn camera footage, or after they watch the footage, they may that gives us a better picture. So actually, officers can benefit from this. But like the perception was, again, in the field, we are being observed, and this is not good, and we're not going to benefit from it. So the something that I can share is, now they're more aware that actually body-worn camera is good for them, not observing them all the time. They can utilize this tool in many other ways.
All right, Dr. Lawrence.
Thanks. The thing that I'm thinking about right now, so being at a national nonprofit research organization, we often will have sites throughout the country. And you may have heard of this term. I think the term is like parachuting researchers, right? We drop in, we collect data, and then we're out of there. And that's something that does happen. I've certainly done that myself. But we want to make sure that, the partners in our studies, law enforcement agencies, are going to benefit from partnering with us. So at least in my studies, aside from all the, media conversations, academic publishing and things like that, I want to make sure I'm going to provide information to the department that they're going to be able to digest and have it be useful for them. So I usually use two methods. So one, I'll always have a site-specific report that's typically 5 pages or less, high-level bullet points that just hit about what we did, how we did it, and what were the main results. And that's just something shared with the points of contact that we have throughout the project to ensure that they understand everything that we did and the main findings of it. Something else I often write, which is a little bit more in detail, is just a summary of the project that I often try to get to the chief, because they know that their agency, or they may not know that their agency is part of this project. We're giving them a summary of the work that we've done and the main findings, similar to the site-specific report, but something that they can read and have an understanding, potentially for any media that's come their way down the line.
All right, thanks to all three of you for those responses. I'm looking at the clock. I believe we are out of time. So thank you to the three presenters. Thank you for the attendees who joined us.